extended families, or in general networks of interpersonal relations, are very important for resharing. For a variety of reasons. In developing countries, for one, individuals are subject to considerable shocks, especially in rural areas. So income can be very volatile and at very low levels. So shocks are frequent. It can have very serious consequences. At the same time, often there is no formal infrastructure to provide a safety net for these individuals, and so many rely on resharing across using interpersonal relations, and obviously extended family can be very important there. I think there is not a huge amount of formal studies of personal networks in developed countries. There is some, but not a huge amount. I do think that they are important, and the example of Spain that you mentioned is definitely would be very interesting to study formally. I come from Italy, and it's another place where extended families and interpersonal relationship may play a big role. Having said that, recently we did a study of the extent of resharing in extended families in the US. Because they have data, the PSID, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, which was started in 1968, and they start with a group of families, and then they follow the spin-offs. So one can consider interactions across the siblings and different family members. And what we find there is that, at least for that context, families were not that important in sharing risk. But again, that's a specific situation. It might well be the case that in other contexts, like the Spanish one that you mentioned, they may be much more important.
Mm-hmm.
One natural question that comes to mind when you look at resharing is that typically you don't observe perfect resharing. You know, if you and I are part of a family, each time we get an income that is high or low, and it might be very, very risky, ex ante, the optimal thing to do is to say, okay, we'll split the income, and so it's much smoother. That doesn't happen. Doesn't happen at this level. There is some resharing, but not complete. And so the natural question to us there is, and that's something I will discuss this afternoon in the presentation, is why is that the case? And so you can start thinking about imperfections that might prevent perfect resharing. And information is a simple one. You know, you and I join this network, but I might not be sure of your income. You might have ways to hide it, or the signal that I observe is only a noisy measure of your income. And therefore, it might be difficult to share risk perfectly, simply because income is not completely observable. The imperfect information, therefore, is potentially very, very important. The other big thing that might be relevant in, and by the way, that's why families might be important rather than just some random stranger, because families might have ways to provide better information, and so. And the information is one of the challenges. The other one is the enforceability of contracts. So you and I enter an agreement. We say, okay, if your income is low, I'll help you out. If my income is low, you help me out. Now, suppose that my income is low, and I come to you, and you say, really, I never said that. And so it's difficult to enforce this informal, or it might be difficult to enforce those informal contracts. So that's another issue.
Mm-hmm.
that's an interesting question. We don't know a huge amount about that. There might be very many ways to share risk. I mean, the most obvious one is transfers. You are in a difficult situation, I send you some money. But there might be other ways. For instance, I can help you with some work in the fields. I can provide food. I can provide services of different nature. So there are all different ways to share risk. That's why, and collect information, all these kind of informal transfers can be very, very difficult. So that's why some of the tests that we use focus on consumption, which is at the end what matters in terms of utility and well-being. And therefore, being able to assess the amount we're sharing without needing information about all the million transfers that might be happening across people, it can be very useful. I have a little anecdote. Many years ago, when I started looking at these things in developing countries, I was in rural Mexico, and so I went to see, there was some data collection going on. And so I went with the interviewers to check how things were and to get an idea. So the interviewer was interviewing this lady. She was 65 or something. And so first they asked questions about consumption, and she knew everything. I mean, well, consumption is very simple because they're poor. So I eat so many beans and so much rice, and I paid for this, for that, and all that. She knew everything. And then the guy said, okay, now we talk about income. I said, what's your husband's income? And she said, 0. I said, okay. What about your son's income? 0. What about your income? 0. And so the guy was saying, well, how did you find the money to buy the rice that you said you bought last week? Oh, this is because actually my daughter sent me her child to look after, and because of that, she sent me some rice. And, everything was justified by some sort of arrangement. And then you realize that, yeah, consumption for these people may be simple, but their income is very complicated because it's made of all these agreements, and getting information on that may be very, very difficult. Indeed, and I think measurement is a really important thing. In simple ways, like the one I was mentioning, there was a very good, well-designed survey and with very traditional measures, and they should be implemented carefully. Having said that, I think that as economists, we haven't put enough effort in developing measures of other aspects of reality. And for instance, in the lecture that I will give today, we use measures of asymmetric information, which is not trivial, but one has to be ingenious to try to get. Typically, measurement has to be informed by theory. Another example, another thing that I've been studying quite a lot is child development and parental investment. And when you try to model parental investment, you need to know what these parents think about the process of development. You observe a parent doesn't read to their child. Why don't they? It could be because they don't like, or they don't know how to read, or they don't have books, or it could be simply that they think it's not useful. And so I think for a researcher is very interesting to look at what are the motivations, and in order to get at that, you need to get information on their beliefs and their expectations and their attitudes. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a very active research agenda that should be developed mm-hmm. more. Conclusion is a big word, but yeah, there are. What we find is that indeed our measures of asymmetric information is important for resharing, and we do observe that the households where extended households where there is better information, they are also better at resharing. Now, the reason I say that's only a partial conclusion, the way I see it is a first step towards an investigation, because we need to understand better how this information travels across networks, what is the role played by different people in the networks. So indeed, at the end of the paper, we're looking at, we do network analysis and we try to construct measures of the role of each individual in the network and whether that can affect the resharing. And I think even from a theoretical point of view, there are some interesting models that are being developed. I wish I knew. I think that's what we do know in that field is that really early interventions, and I'm talking from 0 to 3 years of age, are very, very important. We know that that's the case. What kind of interventions, how intense, for how long, we have some ideas, but we don't know. The reading of the evidence that I have and my instinct is that the intervention that try to change and improve parental practices can be very important. That's why I was saying earlier, you know, what parents do is driven by many things. It is obviously driven by resources. So rich parents have an easier life. But it's also driven by their perception of the process, what they think is useful. It's driven by tastes. And it's also driven by how resources are distributed within the household. So wives might have different ideas from husbands, and therefore they might allocate resources differently. And so in the end, the balance of power may be very important in determining parental practices. So there are lots of things to study. One of the big challenges that we have is how do we implement those things at scale? Because one thing is to run that on 300 children in a very controlled fashion. A completely different or a very different game is to try to implement such an intervention in a country or in a region. And there you face lots of constraints, including constraints about human resources available, because obviously, you know, often when you do a study, you send really smart people to implement the intervention. We have to do it at scale. It has to be done by people that might be not as fluent into these things. One. And two, I believe that scalability, another aspect of scalability that is not often thought about, is the fact that if you're trying to change behavior, which is what you do when you do parenting intervention, you need to find a way to convey the right messages in the right fashion. You need to reach out to the poor people. Poor people are talked to. There are lots of people. They receive many messages. And why should they trust those messages? So you need to find the right channel to talk to them and to involve them. And therefore, community participation, community ownership of the programs can become very important. It's not easy. We've been doing some work. We have done some work in Colombia. We've been doing some work in India. And interaction with policymakers can be very difficult because there are lots of different constraints. In addition to find the right intervention that can be implemented at scale with the human resources that one has, there are all sorts of institutional constraints. You talk to a ministry and they say, oh, we don't do early years. Early years is responsibility of this other minister. Or the opposite, you say, you do something with a program and then a ministry comes, why do you do this with these guys? These guys are supposed to do something else. We are doing early years. So there are all these institutional jealousies, and the political economy. The political economy is very hard. We have done some work that shows that building up huge childcare centers is not particularly useful. The structures are nice, but what is useful is the processes. But structures, building a big center, a big nursery, is easier for politicians because they can go in the press and cut the ribbon and take pictures in front of the place. So the political economy is also complicated. So there are many challenges.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the last 20-25 years have been quite problematic. There are lots of things happening around the world in many different countries, you know, in the UK, in the US, in Europe, a bit everywhere. And I think there have been overall some big progress because there's been economic growth. The number of poor people in the world has declined substantially. The expansion of trade has been quite instrumental for that. Having said that, there have been large sectors of society around the world that have been left behind. And therefore, we are in a phase in which governments should try to think about the construction of new safety nets, new welfare states that address the big problems that we face now, which is the fact that some skills have become obsolete in some parts of the world. So you need to find a way to not to leave these people behind. Ideally through reskilling, but if that doesn't work, with assistance, with ways to maintain some decent quality of life. And that's important because it's fair, but it's also important because for the next generation. So the big risk is that if there are large sectors of societies that are left behind, that they're left to despair, and it could be happening in Western Pennsylvania or in Northeast England or somewhere in Spain, then one risk is that the children of that generation will be affected, and that would have very long-run consequences. So I think, you know, thinking of training programs on guaranteeing equality of opportunities to different sectors of society is very important in the years to come.